Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at my third and final game this weekend that I'm playing here in the German Bundesliga in Fahrenheit. Now, as you guys know, I played 2 games so far. I drew in the first game with a black piece against Matthias Bluebaum. Yesterday, I had a tough game against a former 5-time world champion, Vishwanathan, and today I'm playing against one of my fellow competitors in the upcoming candidates tournament in Toronto, Canada, in April. And that player, of course, would be Nijat Abasov from Azerbaijan, who finished in a remarkable 4th place in the FIDE World Cup last August or September, I think it was. And we are playing today in a preview of a matchup from the candidates. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. So, in this game, I'm playing with the black pieces. Once again, I apologize for the layout of the board, but many of you guys in the comments have complained about how the result is known when I take it directly from the events page. So if the layout is a little bit off, once again, I do apologize, but we don't want any spoilers. So, the game starts with d4. I play d5, we get c4, e6, knight to f3, and now once again, I play the classic Janowski system within the Queen's Gambit decline. Now, one of the ways in which I've been able to actually keep my rating up, stay sharp in chess, and mind you, this is going to sound like an ad even though it's not, is that there's this great site called Chessable. Now, in Chessable, many grandmasters, for whatever reason, decide to share their secrets about various opening strategies. And before this tournament, I was perusing Chessable, and I found this great course by Max Vornerdam, the young GM from the Netherlands, and he had a course on this Janowski. So I played against Matthias Bluebaum in the first game of the black pieces, and again, I decided to play it today against Nijat Abasov. So, Abasov plays bishop g5. And one other thing that I want to point out, you guys, is that this game was played at 10 o'clock in the morning. The first game that I played was at 4 p.m. The second game was at 2 p.m. And today we start the game super early, so I had pretty much just woken up as I went to the round. So, after bishop g5, I play bishop e7. We trade the bishops on e7. Abasov plays knight d2. I go knight f6. And here he plays the move g3. Now, I had looked at my files last night before I went to sleep, but already just waking up and showing up at the round, I kind of lose my way immediately. So after g3, I play this move c5. Now, what happened here is I actually confused my lines. I was expecting him to play rook c1, castles, and then after g3, the line that I could have played in the game would have worked. Now, the line that I'm referring to is after c5 takes d4 takes rook d8 here. Black has sacrificed 2 pawns in the center of the board, but after knight b3 and a5 here, black is threatening to play a4 and kick the knight away from this b3 square where it guards the pawn. And if white plays this move a4, black can go bishop d7, pressuring the pawn on a4. If white goes rook a1, there's this move bishop to c6 with pressure on the diagonal, pressure on the d file, and black is already a little bit better. So let's rewind back to the game. After knight f6, g3 is played, I decide to play this move c5 here, confusing my lines because after d takes c5, castles, and bishop g2, now I play this move d4. Now, the funny thing is the computer does not actually say this is horrible because after knight takes d4, I could take the pawn, but I was still sort of groggy having woken up right before the game, and I decided to play the exact same line with rook d8, knight b3, and a5. But there is a big difference here. White has played the move bishop to g2 instead of the move rook c1, which means that now after white plays a4, stopping me from pushing the pawn forward, if I were to play bishop d7, the pawn is guarded by the rook, and white will simply castle here, and white is up 2 pawns and probably close to winning. So, after this move is played, I spent a lot of time here. I played this move knight d7 after nearly a 50-minute think, and the reason is that I simply didn't know what to do. I'm down 2 pawns here. White can castle out of the center. There are no obvious ideas like a4, and I was actually really unhappy with what was going on because I realized that I had made a mistake. So, I play the move knight f d7. My opponent castles, I take this pawn, and he goes knight to e4, and now I play queen c7, he goes queen c2, and I found a very nice idea with knight to a6. Now, the reason I was really happy to find this idea is that I have a simple plan. I want to put this knight on c5, but I also want to put this bishop on c6 as well. So the idea of developing the bishop, putting the knight on the square, even though I'm down a pawn here, if I can ever get this knight to c5, it's always a nice outpost because the pawn on b2 cannot move to b4 as I would capture the pawn, so therefore the knight is very secure. So, Abasov plays rook to d1, I go bishop to d7, and now he plays this move knight g5, threatening to try and checkmate me on this h7 square. Here I go f5. If I were to play h6, white can jump in with the queen with queen h7, king f8, and knight to f3. And in this position, white is much better, if not winning, because say I play bishop c6, there's queen to h8, checking the king to e7, queen takes g7, and it's spaghetti-o time. I'm already close to loss. So I go f5. If I play g6, white can maybe go queen c3 with the idea of knight e4 and knight f6. And the king looks really, really weak on the dark squares here with these pawns having been pushed and no dark square b to fianchetto. So I go f5 instead. I take away the square from the horse, and now I just want to go knight c5. Abasov plays e4. I kick the horse with h6, knight to f3, and now I take this pawn on e4. Now, I wasn't really sure if I should take on e4 or play this move f4. Ultimately, I decided not to play f4 because I wasn't sure what was going on after this move e5, f takes g3, h takes g3 here, and I thought that maybe the pawn on e6 is a little bit weak. White can maybe go bishop to h3 to pressure it. Their ideas like rook to d6. And if white could somehow get the connect 3 with the 3 pawns here, I thought that white would be doing very well. So I thought the idea of the outpost with rook d6, the idea of f4, and the weakness on e6, all 3 of these reasons were why I did not go f4. Even though the computer actually thinks that here after knight c5, if white goes rook d6, I can simply play bishop c6. And as you guys can tell from the evaluation bar, the position is apparently equal. So instead, I decide to take the pawn on e4. Abasov captures. Now I go knight c5, essentially completing my development as I get the nice outpost for the knight here, targeting the queen and the pawn. And after queen c2, bishop c6, I thought I was doing quite well here because now I've completed development. The pawn on a4 is very weak, and I can maybe try to play on the d file as well. Now here, Abasov plays a couple of really good moves. He plays the move rook e1, which is a move that I did not really understand. I thought here already I was close to equal and I should have no issues, but after rook e1 was played, I had to make a tough decision. Do I trade for the knight on f3 or do I leave the knight on the board? Ultimately, I decided to trade the bishop for the knight because I felt that after, say, rook d6 and knight e5, let's say I trade and go rook d8 here, I thought that white could play rook e2, and white has his own outpost with the knight on e5. He can even play f4 to reinforce it. There's no entry on the second rank. There's no kebabs here, and the pawn on a4 is actually not very weak as the queen and the rook guard it. So, in view of that, I decided to trade the bishop for the knight and go rook d4, trying to argue that this light square b is not as good as my knight on c5. Knight guards both of the pawns on b7 and e6. It pressures the pawn on a4, and the knight can't be kicked away by b4 because I have the pawn to capture. And when you combine that with the double stack in the center, I figured I was a little bit worse here, but I should have very good practical chances to save the game. So, Abasov goes rook d1. I played rook d8, and here I actually offered Abasov a draw, I think after rook d8, or maybe it was after rook takes d4, because I felt that I was a little bit worse here, but I also thought that in the long term, this knight is much better than this light square b, because the knight is guarding and targeting the pawn, and if I get queen d7 as well, I thought there were chances I could win the game. So I actually offered a draw. I think it was on this move. It could have been after rook a d8. But Abasov declined and decides to play on with this move, rook to e3. Now I go queen to d7, lining up the double stack and pressuring the pawn on a4. Abasov plays bishop to h5 here, and this is where I actually got a little bit scared, because on first glance, I thought I could take the pawn on a4, but after white goes queen g6, white's king is very, very safe. It's headed to g2. A sample line is queen to d7, and after rook to f3, suddenly white is threatening to go rook f7 here, attack me on the 7th rank, and I'm probably actually lost. If I were to play something like queen c6, another idea as well, white can go queen f7, king h8, and now I believe white might even have, oh no, bishop g6 allows mate in 1, but white can play something like rook f3, I go like rook d8, bishop g6, and with this great light square b covering the square, there are all kinds of threats of checkmate on the back rank here, and even though the computer says this is okay, I was very, very worried. So, I decided instead to play rook d3, trying to eliminate one of white's aggressive pieces here. It also stops white from ever going rook f3 and rook to f7, so I go rook d3. Abasov plays queen e2, and now I play the move b6, reinforcing the horse on c5. There are a lot of lines where I would love to take and maybe go queen a4, but now my horse on c5 will hang. So when I play b6, the pawn reinforces the knight now guards the pawn and the rook, and it just seems like a very good move also because I put the pawn on the opposite color, this light square b. Bishop can no longer target this pawn on b6. So after b6, Abasov plays this move, bishop g6, and this is a big mistake here. I think that at this point, white is still better, but white is going to have to be very precise. When Abasov plays bishop g6, it's very clear that he overlooked the next series of moves that I played. I trade the rooks on e3, and now I go queen d1 check, king g2, and queen g4, removing this bishop from this very annoying g6 square where it basically hems in my king. Abasov goes bishop d3, and now I play queen to d1 back. And here Abasov plays the move bishop e2. Abasov could have played bishop g6 back and simply made a draw. And in fact, I think at this point in the game, it would have been the prudent decision, because at this point, Abasov has kind of lost most of his advantage. And in the long term, this dark square knight versus light square b could be much better. So Abasov goes bishop e2. I take this pawn, and now he plays the move queen e5. Here I go king to h7, and the reason I play king h7 here is that while it looks scary, the pawn covers the check, the knight covers the other square on e4, and the d3 square as well. So white cannot line up any checks on this long diagonal, at least not right away. Abasov goes queen d6. Now I play queen to b3. Apparently queen c2 would have been enough to draw, but I wasn't sure about the resulting endgame after queen takes pawn, queen takes bishop, and queen takes c5. I did see queen e4, but I thought after king to h3, if anything, white is better. White has an extra pawn here. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. So white has an extra pawn here, and I was also getting a little bit low on time. So because I'm getting a little bit low on time here, I don't want to go into an endgame where I have to find only moves to try and save the game. So I play queen b3, guarding the pawn and pressuring the pawn on b2. Abasov plays queen d2, and now I play this very, very committal move e5. Now, I did not like this move e5. It felt a little bit weakening, so I was worried the bishop can maybe get to f5 down the road. But on the other hand, if white were to play a move like bishop to d1, for example, after queen takes pawn and bishop c2, now I have e4 closing down the diagonal. So on the one hand, I weaken this f5 square, but I also prevent white from ever lining up anything on the long diagonal because the pawn will run interference. So here Abasov plays a huge blunder with this move bishop g4. Now this is a move that I think Abasov simply blundered. He was just a little bit tired. He'd been trying to press the whole game. The advantage was slipping away, and he makes this mistake. What he should have played was the move queen d5, because after queen b2 and bishop g4, white is still a little bit better after queen c2 and queen to f7 here because of the light square weaknesses around my king. Alas, the gods were smiling on me, and Abasov blunders with this move bishop g4. I simply take this pawn, and now after bishop f5, I have this move g6. Now, I did not talk to Abasov after the game, so I don't know what he missed. My guess is that he probably thought after g6, he simply had queen to d7. But if you play queen e7, you're doing the classic Botez gambit. I snap the queen, and I win the game. So after g6, he has to go back, but now once I play queen d4, queen to e2, and e4, the diagonal is closed here. On top of that, I've got a great horse on c5, and now I have an extra pawn here and all the chances to win the game. Abasov plays move h4, and now I've played a move that I think is the best move, but it's a move that I felt was a little bit wrong, which is h5. And the reason that this move felt wrong in retrospect is that I put all the pawns on the same color as the light square b, and if I go king g7, h5, g5, for example, in an endgame, these pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop, and the counterplay which ends up happening in the game would not exist. So after h4, I play this move h5 here, and now Abasov plays this move f3, I go e3, and he plays this move f4. Now, initially, I thought f3 was simply a blunder, and after e3, I was winning. But as soon as Abasov played f4, I realized that while I still am much better, it gets very tricky. Because initially, I thought I could play something like queen to d2, or not queen d2, sorry. I thought I could play something like queen d5, king g1, and then something like king h6. But this game actually would end in a draw then, because I can sack the bishop, queen takes pawn, check takes, and now there's f5, checking the king. And white can very simply just start checking all over the board. If I go this way, it doesn't really matter. White just forces a repetition. So at the end of the day, I had to play this move queen to d2. Abasov goes king to f3. And now I play this very nasty move knight to b3. The reason this move is so important is that if I don't play knight b3, white is simply going to trade the queens or take the pawn. Say I go king g7, white can trade. And after king e2, knight b3, maybe not bishop c2, but probably bishop e4 followed by bishop d5, white should be completely fine. So I play this move knight to b3, and now there's some geometry involved, because if white does not take this pawn on e3, let's say he trades, now I take with the knight, and I fork the king and the bishop, and if white moves the queen to any of these squares on the diagonal, you lose the game as there is a fork. If you go to c4, I check, and then I fork with knight d2. If you go to b5, I have knight d4 forking the king and the queen. If you go queen to a6, I check, and then I go knight c5 once again, forking the king and the queen. So because of that, Abasov has to take the pawn. Now I check, he goes king e4, and I take this pawn on b2. Now, all the way back when I was thinking after the move h5, I saw the line that occurred in the game, which is this very tricky move king to d5. On first glance, I remember looking at this before I played h5. I thought that this was just winning easily. For example, say white goes bishop d3. I have knight to f5. There's pressure on the pawns. The king is in the middle of the board, and my queen guards the pawn on b6, so it's GG on the spot. If white plays queen d3 here, now I can go a4, just start pushing p up the board, and I should win very routinely. But after king to d5, I have to be very, very careful here, because if I do not have the move that I play in the game, knight f5, the game would actually end in a draw. If I take the bishop, once again, white just starts checking all over the board, and I have no way of escaping the checks, as white just checks between these two squares, g5, e7, and e8. That's 3 squares, I know, but you get the point. So I play the move knight to f5, Abasov takes, and now I play this move queen to b5, checking the king. He goes king d6, and now I take the bishop on f5. Now, I assumed in this position, I'm up a pawn here. I have 2 connected pawns rolling up the queen side. This should be a pretty straightforward win. But not so fast. Abasov checks, I go king g8, and now he plays this very tricky move, queen to e5. It's worth pointing out if white were to play king c6, all these pawn endgames are losing, because after check takes and king c5, I just walk the king straight up, and this is a win, because I get the king all the way over, and I'm in time to capture, and then I go g5, takes, and I just push the pawn, march the king up, and then I just go h3, h2, h1, and make a queen. Additionally, if white plays king b5, I have a very important move here, which is not king f7. So if I go this way, white can take, and after king e6, I guess king d5 wins, but say I were to go to f5, this, I believe, is a draw, or I thought it was. King here takes, and king e5. And apparently king g4 is winning. The line that I saw in my head was takes, and after king f6, king g4 takes, h4, f5. Both sides end up queening, and the game will be a draw. But as I was starting to say, after king b5, I can just play c4, because if white takes this one, now the pawn is free. And after takes, I go this way. King has to come back. And once again, the king is simply too far away here, as I will be able to gobble all the pawns and win with the 2 connected h and g pawns. So in this position, Abasov plays move queen to e5, which is a very tricky move, because if I were to trade, after pawn takes, a4, e6, white is actually queening here. If I go king f8, there's king d7, followed by e7 and e8. So here I play the move queen to f8. Now, this move is completely reasonable. I actually suspect that a4 is perhaps a little bit better, but I played the check. Abasov goes king c6, and I offer the trade of queens. And you're thinking, okay, queens are coming off the board, you win the game. But once again, Abasov has this move king to d7, and I cannot trade the queens, as the king covers a critical queening square, and the pawn just marches right up the board. Nonetheless, I played the move a4 here, because I figure at this point, white can't really do anything with f5. White can't trade the queen, so now I should try and push p, make a second queen on the a file, and it should be basic. But as it turns out, the game is nowhere near over, because Abasov finds the only resource left, which is this great pawn sacrifice with g4. Take the pawn, of course. But now he goes h5. And the game, which I thought was over about like 5 moves ago, suddenly begins again, because if I were to take the pawn on h5, after queen e6, king g7, f5, white's threatening f6, queen g6, and if I go queen d4, the king now assists with this king e7 move, and suddenly the game ends in a draw. If I check, he just goes, not e8, sorry, goes to d7, and I have no way of stopping queen g6. If I check, he always goes back. If I go queen f8, there's check, takes, and then I think even here, takes, block, takes, and king e7, followed by f6 and f7, would also be a draw. So I thought I was winning, and then suddenly after h5, I realized the game is starting over. I have to try and win again. So here I play the move queen to f8, because if I were to play g3, another option here, after queen e6, the game will end in a draw. When I go king g7, he takes, and there's always this yo-yo between e8 and g6, because the pawn covers a square, and there's simply no way of escaping the yo-yo, and the game is a draw by repetition. So here I go queen to f8, trying to block with queen f7 check. If he were to play queen e6, Abasov takes, I go queen g7 check. Apparently a3 is the best move, but at this point, it's so hard to play with only 18 minutes on the clock, and especially a queen and pawn endgame, you have to be very careful, because there usually are 20 million checks that exist, like queen d5, queen e6, ladders with, for example, say he goes check, and then something like queen h5 or queen d4, and just in general, it's very, very difficult. So I go queen g7 check, Abasov plays king d8, I take the pawn, and now he plays this move f5. Here I go queen g5, and he plays the move king e8, correctly trying to bring the king closer, use it as an attacking piece, but also support the pawn push to f6 and f7. So here I play the move g3, he goes queen e6, and now I go king to h7, goes f6, I play g2, and now he plays this move f7. Now again, you'll see the bar is not moving much, but during the game, you're really unsure of what's going on. And I have to point out that at this point, before queen e6, Abasov had 47 minutes, I had about 11 minutes, and when he saw for 20 minutes, the line that occurs in the game, I was really thinking long and hard on both these checks where I would put the king. So when he checked, I instantly played king h7 to gain some time, and he's now only up about 16 minutes on the clock. So he goes to f6, g2, f7, and now I play the only move to win. You're probably thinking, well, can't you just queen? White will make a queen and the game goes on. But if I queen here, I promote to a queen, white can under-promote to a knight here, and there's actually a forced checkmate. If I go king g7, there's queen f7, king h8, and queen h7. Beautiful checkmate. Same thing for h6. And if after he promotes, I go king to h8, now there's queen to h3 check, king g7, and now there's this move queen to d7 check. If I go to f6, he checks, and it's the same problem with queen to h7 checkmate. So I throw in the check first on the king. He plays king here, and now I'm able to promote because here if white promotes to a knight, now I can go king to g7 here because the knight is unprotected. And after queen e7 and king g8, white could check here, but it's not checkmate because I take the horse since the king is one square too far away. So Abasov promotes to a queen, I check, he goes king c7. Now, of course, I have to trade off a set of the queens because if we both keep our queens on the board, my king is going to get mated in one or two moves. So I check, queens come off, he goes here, and now I play the move a3. Abasov plays queen f6, and after this move b5, Abasov rather abruptly resigns the game here. Now, the reason that Abasov resigned is because he doesn't really have a good move. If he goes king to a6 here, I can play queen c4, followed by this move b4 here, and while white is always going to have 20 million checks, eventually the king is going to escape. My queen covers the f4 square, and long term there will be no perpetual. I'll eventually run the king behind the pawn, something like this, for example, and down the road, after, say, block, check here, queen check, I go king b1, queen to f1, I can go king c2, check, block, check, and now after king b2, there finally are no more checks, and I'll be able to shield the king with these two pawns and win the game. So Abasov resigns here after b5. I was definitely surprised that he didn't play on. I mean, a sample line also be something like check, check here, check, and king c4, check, king here. But the problem is long term, I can always block again. And down the road, I'll be able to hide the king eventually. Say king here, check, b4, check, king a4, let's just say check. And now I can go queen b5 to trade. If he goes check, I hide the king on b3. And so it's all completely winning with the queen and the pawns, but it's not straightforward. And perhaps Abasov could have played more. But Abasov, I guess, at this point was tired. He also trusted my technique that I would be able to win this. And so he resigned the game here after this move b5. So, what to say about this game? A very shaky game for me. I confused my move orders in the opening. I was in a lot of trouble, but I kept it together. I just kept playing good moves, and eventually I was able to turn the tide when Abasov finally blundered with this bishop g4 move. I capitalized. Eventually, I win this game, which means that for my 3 Bundesliga games, I win 1 game, I draw 2 games, and I actually gain, I believe, 1 or 2 rating points, so it's all pretty good. Also, on top of that, as I mentioned at the start of the recap, today I was playing against Nijat Abasov from Azerbaijan, who did qualify for the candidates tournament in Toronto. Now, when you're playing against someone right before a big event like this, the psychology does matter. And considering that I basically gave Abasov 2 free pawns in the opening due to my mix-up with the preparation, and Abasov not only was he not able to win the game, but I was able to turn the tide completely and win from being down 2 pawns, should give me a big boost for when I do play him in the upcoming candidates tournament. At any rate, it's only 1 game, so we'll see how it goes. But this event definitely has turned into a success, both for my club, Schachklub Fierenheim, as well as myself. I gained some rating points. It looks like the team is very likely going to win the Schach Bundesliga for the first time in their history since we did defeat Baden-Baden, who are the 16-time winners of the German Bundesliga. But at any rate, that's going to be it for now. So on that note, if you guys have not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back from the other side of the pond, back in America tomorrow, and we'll be back with some good recaps and other stuff in the near future. But I hope you guys have enjoyed my recaps here from Fierenheim in Germany of the German Bundesliga, and I will see you guys next week. Have a great rest of your weekend. See you guys. Bye.